The signal officer aboard HMS Hood handed Vice Admiral James Somerville a decrypt and stepped back. Somerville read it twice. Then he set it down on the chart table and stared at the North African coastline through the bridge windows. The Mediterranean was calm that morning, deceptively peaceful, the kind of blue that made men forget there was a war on. Somewhere beyond that horizon lay the French fleet, ships that had been fighting alongside the Royal Navy just 3 weeks earlier. Ships crewed by men Somerville had trained with, drunk with, called friends. The signal ordered him to sink them. Somerville was 57 years old. He had served in the Royal Navy for 4 decades. He had seen action at the Dardanelles, commanded destroyers in the Channel, risen to flag rank through talent and determination. Just months earlier, tuberculosis had nearly ended his career. Now he stood on the bridge of the most powerful warship in the world, holding orders that made him physically ill. It was July the 1st, 1940. France had fallen, Britain stood alone, and Somerville had just received what he would later call the most hateful order ever given to a British admiral. The French fleet at Mers-el-Kébir represented a nightmare scenario for Winston Churchill. 2 modern battle cruisers, Dunkirk and Strasbourg, 2 older battleships, Bretagne and Provence, 6 destroyers. Collectively, they carried enough firepower to alter the balance of the entire war at sea. If Germany seized these ships, or pressured Vichy France into handing them over, the combined Axis fleet would outnumber the Royal Navy by 50%. The Mediterranean would become an Axis lake. The Atlantic convoy routes would face catastrophe. Britain might not survive the year. Churchill's war cabinet met 3 times on the 24th of June alone. The conclusion was unanimous. The French fleet must not, under any circumstances, fall into German hands. If the French would not join Britain, sail to neutral ports, or scuttle their ships, then the Royal Navy would destroy them. The man chosen to deliver this ultimatum was Somerville. He was 57 years old, recently recovered from tuberculosis, and had been pulled out of retirement just weeks earlier to command the newly formed Force H at Gibraltar. He was respected throughout the service as a tactical innovator and a man of deep personal integrity. That integrity was about to be tested in ways no peacetime career could have prepared him for. When Somerville received his orders, his reaction was immediate and visceral. He signalled the Admiralty that he was impressed with the view that the use of force should be avoided at all costs. Captain Cedric Holland, the former naval attaché in Paris who would deliver the ultimatum, agreed completely. Holland spoke fluent French. He knew the French naval officers personally. He believed that with patience the French could be persuaded. An attack, he warned, would alienate every Frenchman everywhere. The Admiralty's response was unequivocal. The firm intention of His Majesty's government is that if the French will not accept any of your alternatives, they are to be destroyed. That night, as Force H sailed south through the darkness, Somerville received another signal. This one came from Admiral Dudley Pound, the First Sea Lord. It read, "You are charged with one of the most disagreeable and difficult tasks that a British admiral has ever been faced with, but we have complete confidence in you and rely on you to carry it out relentlessly." Somerville understood the message beneath the words. There would be no reprieve. There would be no last-minute change of orders. If the French refused, he would have to kill them. If this kind of naval history is what you have been looking for, subscribing genuinely helps. It tells the algorithm there is an audience for serious Royal Navy content. Now, back to Mers-el-Kébir. Force H sailed through the night of July the 2nd. Hood, the largest warship in the Royal Navy at 42,000 tons. The battleships Valiant and Resolution. The aircraft carrier Ark Royal. 11 destroyers. Enough firepower to level a city. And ahead of them, unaware of what was coming, nearly 5,000 French sailors were waking to what they thought would be an ordinary morning in port. Aboard the battleship Bretagne, an 18-year-old gunner named André Jaffre climbed to his station as the sun rose over the Algerian coast. When lookouts spotted the British ships on the horizon, excitement rippled through the crew. The British had arrived. Jaffre and his shipmates assumed they had come to collect the French fleet and continue the fight against Germany together. They were happy. They thought their allies had come to take them back to war. They had no idea that those same allies were loading armour-piercing shells into 15-inch guns. The negotiations that followed were a masterclass in diplomatic failure. Captain Holland approached the harbour at 4:45 in the morning aboard the destroyer Foxhound. Admiral Marcel Bruno Gensoul, commanding the French squadron, refused to meet him. Gensoul was deeply offended that the British had sent a captain rather than Somerville himself. He considered it an insult to his rank. For hours, Holland was forced to negotiate through an intermediary, passing messages back and forth while the clock ran down. The ultimatum offered 5 choices: sail with the British and continue fighting, sail to a British port with reduced crews, sail to Martinique or the United States for demilitarization, sail to a neutral American port, or scuttle within 6 hours. If all were refused, Force H would open fire. Here is where the tragedy deepened. When Gensol signalled the French Admiralty, he transmitted only part of the ultimatum. He reported that the British had demanded he sink his ships within 6 hours, or face destruction by force. He omitted the options to sail to America or Martinique, options that actually aligned with standing French orders, authorising the fleet to sail to the United States rather than risk capture by a foreign power. Admiral Darlon, who might have approved one of these alternatives, was in transit between Bordeaux and Vichy and could not be reached in time. I think this was the moment the tragedy became inevitable, not through malice but through wounded pride, poor communication, and the fog of a collapsing world order. Gensol was not a traitor. He was a French officer who believed his honour and his country's honour were being questioned. He responded as such men often do, with defiance rather than accommodation. Somerville, watching from Hood's bridge, deliberately disobeyed his orders. Twice he extended the deadline, hoping for a breakthrough. When Gensol finally agreed to meet Holland face-to-face at 3 in the afternoon, Somerville seized the chance. For 2 hours, the two men talked aboard Dunkirk. Gensol produced Darlan's standing orders proving the French would never surrender their ships to Germany. But he refused to act without fresh instructions from Vichy, instructions that were not coming. At 4:46 in the afternoon, the Admiralty, having intercepted French signals showing reinforcements were being dispatched from Algiers, sent Somerville a brutal order: settle matters quickly, or you will have reinforcements to deal with. Somerville sent his final signal at 5:15. If none of the British proposals are accepted by 5:30, it will be necessary to sink your ships. Holland departed Dunkirk at 5:25. As he left, the officer of the watch aboard Bretagne saluted him smartly. Holland later wrote that the French could not believe they were about to become targets of British gunners. At 5:54, Somerville gave the order to open fire. Hood's 15-inch guns spoke first, a sound like the end of the world. Valiant and Resolution followed half a second later. The range was 17,500 yards, roughly 10 nautical miles, close enough to guarantee hits on ships that could not manoeuvre. The first salvo fell short, throwing up columns of water in the harbour. The second struck the breakwater, showering the French ships with concrete fragments. Aboard Bretagne, André Jaffre felt the deck shake beneath his feet. He still did not understand what was happening. The third salvo, fired at 5:57, hit Bretagne directly in her magazines. A column of white smoke rose hundreds of feet into the air. The old battleship, 26,000 tons of steel and nearly 1,200 men, began to roll. Jaffre was thrown against a bulkhead. Around him, men were screaming. The lights went out. Seawater was already pouring through ruptured hull plates. Within 8 minutes, Bretagne capsized completely. 977 sailors died, 86% of her crew. Most never made it off their mess decks. They drowned in the darkness as the ship turned turtle above them. Jaffre, one of the few survivors, would spend the rest of his life wondering why he lived when so many of his friends did not. Dunkirk took 4 15-inch shells. Her electrical systems failed. She beached herself to avoid sinking. Provence flooded her magazines and ran aground. The destroyer leader Mogador lost her entire stern when a shell detonated her depth charges, killing 40 of her crew. In less than 10 minutes, 1,297 French sailors were dead. And then, through the smoke and chaos, Strasbourg made her escape. Captain Louis Collinet had anticipated the attack. While the other French captains assumed this was a bluff, Collinet had ordered his engines to be kept at immediate readiness. As Bretagne exploded beside him, showering his decks with burning debris, he slipped his moorings and drove his battlecruiser through the mined harbour channel at 28 knots. It was seamanship of the highest order, threading a massive warship through obstacles that should have been impassable, all while under fire from the most powerful naval guns in the world. Hood gave chase. Swordfish torpedo bombers from Ark Royal launched 2 attack waves, their obsolete biplanes diving through anti-aircraft fire to release their torpedoes. None scored hits. Strasbourg was too fast, her crew too determined. By 8:20 that evening, with darkness falling and French reinforcements approaching from Algiers, Somerville called off the pursuit. Strasbourg reached Toulon the following morning to a hero's welcome, the only bright spot in an otherwise catastrophic day for the Marine Nationale. Somerville wrote to his wife that night predicting he would be relieved of command for letting the battlecruiser escape. "The truth is," he admitted, "my heart was not in it, and you are not allowed a heart in war." Churchill addressed Parliament the following day. He described the ultimatum, explained the strategic necessity, and closed with words carefully chosen for an audience beyond Westminster. "I leave the judgment of our action with confidence to Parliament. I leave it to the nation, and I leave it to the United States. I leave it to the world and to history." The American reaction was precisely what Churchill had calculated. President Roosevelt, who had been uncertain whether Britain would capitulate like France, was deeply impressed by this demonstration of ruthlessness. Before Mers-el-Kébir, Washington debated withholding arms from Britain for fear they would end up in German hands. After Mers-el-Kébir, the conversation changed. 2 months later, the Destroyers for Bases Agreement was signed, the first step toward Lend-Lease and American entry into the war. In France, the reaction was fury. Vichy severed diplomatic relations. Marshal Pétain condemned the attack as an assault on a neutral ally. German propaganda posters appeared in Paris showing drowning French sailors with the caption, "Remember Oran." De Gaulle found it almost impossible to recruit French sailors to the Free French cause after British guns had killed more than 1,000 of their comrades. But here is the bitter irony that haunts this story. 2 years later, in November 1942, Germany attempted to seize the French fleet at Toulon. Admiral Jean de Laborde ordered the scuttling of every ship of military value. 77 vessels went to the bottom, including Dunkirk, Strasbourg and Provence. Germany captured nothing of consequence. The French had kept their word. They would never have surrendered their fleet. So was Churchill right? Was Mers-el-Kébir necessary? I think the answer is yes and no. And I think anyone who gives you a cleaner verdict is not being honest with the evidence. Churchill could not know in July 1940 that the French would scuttle at Toulon. He could not trust German promises. Hitler had broken every treaty he had ever signed. He could not risk the survival of Britain on the honour of a defeated Allies officer corps, however sincere that honour might be. In the cold calculus of total war, his decision made sense. But Somerville was also right to protest. The attack was morally repugnant. It killed men who had been allies weeks earlier, men who shared the same enemy, men who would never have willingly served Germany. The strategic gain, while real, came at a cost that poisoned Franco-British relations for years and haunted every officer who pulled a lanyard that day. At Alexandria, in contrast, Admiral Andrew Cunningham faced the same situation and resolved it peacefully. Through patient negotiation and mutual respect, he convinced Admiral Godefroy to disarm his ships and remain in port for the duration. No shots were fired. No one died. The ships eventually joined the Free French Navy in 1943. It is worth asking whether Mers-el-Kébir might have ended the same way if Gensoul had been less proud, if Holland had been given more time, if the Admiralty had not been so terrified of French reinforcements. But those are questions for historians. Somerville did not have the luxury of hindsight. He had orders, a deadline, and a fleet of Allied ships in his gun sights. He carried out his duty, and he paid for it in ways that never showed on his service record. Churchill called Mers-el-Kébir a Greek tragedy. He was right. There were no villains in that harbour, only men trapped by circumstance, honour, and the brutal logic of a war that had not yet shown its full horror. Gensoul was not wrong to believe his fleet would never serve Germany. Somerville was not wrong to find the order hateful. Churchill was not wrong to fear what might happen if he gambled on French honour and lost. What we are left with is a story that offers no comfort, only the recognition that war forces choices on men that peace never prepares them for. 1,297 French sailors died at Mers-el-Kébir. 2 years later, the French proved they would have died before surrendering their ships to Germany anyway, and Somerville, the man who gave the order, carried that weight until the day he died in 1949, still regretting the most hateful decision of his career. That is the story,